Debate, the Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to speak today on Bill C-49, which proposes amendments to the Canada Transportation Act to advance the efficiency and competitiveness of our freight rail system. This is especially important to Guelph, which is home to one of Canada's 3 federally chartered railways. The Guelph Junction Railway was established in 1886 by a special act of the federal government to foster economic growth in Guelph and in the surrounding communities. The City of Guelph has owned the railway since 1908. The GJR operates 38.6 kilometres of track that runs from Guelph Junction near Campbellville, Ontario, to Guelph's Northwest Industrial Park. But it is a strategic line that runs between the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Canadian National Railway. Canadian exporters today have the advantage of the lowest freight rates in the world, even lower than in the United States, and a track record of significant investment by the railways that is essential for keeping these rates low in the future. However, even the strongest system has room for improvement, and we've heard concerns from both shippers and railways through our consultation process. We've heard in particular about system bottlenecks and other constraints that slow the movement of our goods. We've heard about delays in shipping that can affect our nation's reputation for reliability. And we've heard about regulations that dampen investment in the network to everyone's detriment. Canada's rail system is the backbone of our export trade. It moves our goods to destinations across the country, to the United States, and for exports overseas. The conditions we establish now in 2017 will be essential for our nation's long-term growth and prosperity. Following extensive consultations, our government is proposing new measures that would lay the groundwork for future success. This bill would promote greater efficiency and investment in the system for the benefit of all Canadians. First, this bill proposes a new competitive access tool for shippers that would allow them to obtain better options for service and rates. This new tool, the long-haul interswitching, would allow a shipper served by only one railway to access a competing railway at a rate and on service terms set by the Canadian Transportation Agency. Long-haul interswitching has been designed to meet the needs of captive shippers across a wide range of sectors, grain, forestry, and mining, just to name a few. And it would apply at a distance of 1,200 kilometers or more to ensure that some of our most remote shippers can benefit. By providing competition between railways, this measure would improve system efficiency in moving goods to market. And at the same time, railways would be fairly compensated for their services and for the cost of maintaining infrastructure. The agency would set the rates under this measure based on comparable traffic. This would help prevent the risk that railways might underinvest or even close their lines due to lack of revenue. As a part of this, we would allow extended interswitching in the prairie provinces to sunset as planned on August 1st. Many of you will recall that this measure was adopted in 2014 under the Fair Rail for Grain Farmers Act in response to the unique challenges in the grain handling and transportation system at that time and in that season. Most challenges no longer exist, and extended interswitching is problematic in many respects. It only applies up to 160 kilometers and only in the prairie provinces. It does not cover other shippers in Canada who have told us about railway service issues. Its rates are far too low to compensate railways for moving the traffic, which would erode investment over time. And a key beneficiary of this measure is not the shipper community, but the American railway, the railway that scoops traffic from Canadian railways but makes comparatively little investment in the Canadian network. Long-haul interswitching is a far better tool as it would apply across sectors and across regions of Canada. The grain sector would be far better off as all captive grain shippers would have access to this competitive tool, not just those falling within a specific zone. The railways would be compensated appropriately to ensure that the system runs smoothly and grain moves to market effectively. And the proposed new measure has also been carefully structured to minimize the risk of American railways unfairly taking traffic. Many of you will recall that the Fair Rail for Grain Farmers Act also imposed minimum volumes of grain to be moved by the railways. In our consultations, we've heard that this has had negative effects. It benefited great specific shippers to the detriment of others. It was good for the large companies, but not for the farmers. And more importantly, the unique challenges of 2014 and that growing season no longer exist. For these reasons, the volume requirements would be allowed to sunset as planned on August 1st. Our government recognizes the importance of moving grain and other commodities efficiently to market. Greater transparency on how well the system is working is obviously critical to efficiency. That is why Bill C-49 would require railways to report publicly every year on their plans to move grain and to manage weather-related disruptions. They would also need to report service and performance metrics that help to measure how the system is doing. And the agency would have clear new authorities to hold an inquiry into any emerging issue at the minister's request. These measures would help all parties to keep track of emerging problems and work together to find solutions before the crisis point hits. And importantly, this bill would provide shippers the ability to maintain reciprocal financial penalties in service agreements. Applying penalties for service failures would encourage the most efficient service possible. Our rail system can only flourish within the right regulatory framework. To promote system efficiency, the bill would also modernize the Canada Transportation Act. For example, it would update the insolvency regime for railways, which dates back to 1903 and cannot address the complexity of modern business arrangements. The railway industry must invest significantly in the network to keep it running safely and smoothly. That's why this bill also proposes measures to promote continued investment. For example, it would loosen shareholder restrictions on CN Railway that have been in place since it was privatized in 1995. Bill C-49 would also fix problems with the maximum revenue entitlement, which caps the revenue per ton that CN and CP and Guelph Junction can earn for moving Western grain. I just threw in Guelph Junction. It would fairly credit their investments in the network and encourage them to obtain new modern hopper cars, and would also promote the movement of grain by containers, an innovative way to provide service and extra capacity at peak periods when the system is full. And again, this would apply across all regions of Canada, including Guelph. Together, these amendments would achieve the goals of a competitive, efficient freight rail system, a system in which commercial forces drive efficiency, but legislative backstops are in place to ensure the system is fair, balanced, and transparent. A system in which the conditions are right for low rates, future investment, and future success. Colleagues, I urge you to adopt Bill C-49 as quickly as possible so we can serve our farm community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You're here.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. Honorable député de Sherbrooke.
The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I heard my colleague clearly. This is a very important issue, the transportation of grain, but I'm having some problem understanding a couple of things he is saying. He's attaching a lot of importance to that aspect in the bill when my colleague from Trois-Rivières just proposed a motion that would break out the bill in order to make grain transportation a priority. It would be sent directly to committee. Unfortunately, though, when he asked for unanimous consent, there were many no's on the other side of the House, the side that my colleague has just spoken on. And so I'm having trouble reconciling the priority that my colleague is attaching to this issue in his speech and the fact that they just turned down a possibility of dealing with that issue separately and immediately in the Transport Committee so that it is passed as quickly as possible, because the 1st of August 2017 is coming very quickly. How does he reconcile the two, to have opposed that motion? And this isn't a political game. It's perfectly reasonable. What we would do this way is expedite the process for that part of the bill. So how can he explain then, having been on the side of the no's against that, when he says that it's such an important issue?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hope I can comment on sufficiently on the question from the member from Sherbrooke, that Bill C-30 was really looking at grain, and it was looking at a bumper crop situation, and it had to do something, and really a Band-Aid solution that focused on the grain market. But if you look at today's market and what we're proposing in C-49, we'd also be handling lumber. And we look at softwood lumber in the United States being an issue. We're looking at new markets in Asia. How do we get lumber to the coast, and lots of it on either coast? So lumber would be something that we'd want to address. Also mining, and when we look at mining coming out of the ground, and how do we get that efficiently to market? How do we get auto parts to market in southwest Ontario? So it's really more than just a Band-Aid solution for grain. We need a comprehensive solution that's part of an integrated transportation strategy, and I think C-49 addresses that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to confess that the interswitching piece of this legislation, the honourable member for Guelph might be able to further explain how that will deal with the efficient allocation of rail to grain shipments so that it reaches destinations in a timely way. I certainly remember in December of 2013, Vancouver Island was 2 days away from being completely out of grain to be milled for livestock to keep the livestock of Vancouver Island farmers fed. It was a very desperate situation. They ended up organizing truck fleets, so of course that increased the price of getting grain to the mills. The mills were normally competitors, but they were actually pooling what grain they had to share it out to make sure that everybody could still be producing what they could to get it to livestock. It was a desperate situation that caught the government unawares. It wouldn't have happened had we had the wheat board. And I'm wondering if the interswitching proposals in this will really give us the oversight and the ability to organize rail so that we match up when grain needs to get to market with available freight shipments.
The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member from the West Coast, Saanich Gulf Islands. The long-haul switching is looking at a couple of things. We've mentioned the 1,200-kilometre limit, but also it would be able to break off up to 50% of the haul in situations where that needed to be done, something like an emergency that she was describing. Each shipment would be negotiated, and so it's important that when we look at the LHI strategy, that each circumstance would be included in the negotiations for each shipment, and rather than a one-size-fits-all. So it's integrated, it covers all types of equipment, and it is flexible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.